So, welcome to this symposium, Rethinking Methodology Matters. I'm Claire Penketh. I'm editor-in-chief, also referred to as principal editor of iJADE. That's the International Journal of Art and Design Education. So, a very, very warm welcome to this event. It might be around 9:15 in the morning, which it is for me, but I know for our main presenters, it's later on in the day. So they're coming into this later in the day. So you're all very welcome wherever you're joining us from, whatever time it is. You're very, very welcome. So this event is designed to support this publication. It's issue 45.1 of iJADE, and we just wanted to have an event where we really wanted to have some communication and conversations around the key issues that are raised. Quite conscious of the fact that once we've got an issue out and live into the world, it's a really nice opportunity for us to have a symposium event where we're lifting some of those ideas off the page or off the screen, if you like. And I'm very pleased that we've got the three guest editors who are joining us to lead on this event. So just a little bit of information about iJADE, for those of you who are not familiar with it. iJADE publishes research in art and design education across all sectors and age ranges. It's an international journal, though it is owned by our national society, the National Society for Education and Design, and it's co-owned with Wiley Publishers. The journal was established in 1982, so it's been going a while, and it publishes 4 issues a year. We've held numerous conference events. I think we're on 14 conferences. We've had in-person and online events. This year, we've got 2 symposium events, this one, and a further online event in November. And our conference will return in November 2027. The event is going to run from 9:15 to around 10:30. That's British summertime, UK. And just to say, it might not run for that whole period of time. We are making the recording of the event available, and that will be available via the NSEAD and iJADE platforms. And if you signed up for this event, then you'll have access to that recording. I do also want to highlight that the issue it has been made fully accessible in terms of there's no cost to access any of the papers. A number of the papers in the issue are already open access, but Wiley have agreed to make all of the papers available. And Diane has put a link to the main page, the web page for the journal, into the chat. So if you want to access any of the papers, that is a limited time. You'll see some of them are highlighted as open access, some are highlighted as fully accessible in terms of, as I say, no paywall. So just wanted to mention something about the audience and editorial ethos for iJADE. iJADE came from, a real desire for art and design educators to pay attention to ways of researching and key issues for research in art and design education, as I say, way back in 1982. It's defined by academic rigor and quality research. We see that the papers that have been published in iJADE should really be leading some of the key debates in art and design education on an international forum. So we're thinking about that in terms of field defining ideas. But we're also thinking about how we do that in terms of leading and supporting a community of art and design educators. And I think it's safe to say that on an international level, that art and design education across sectors is facing some really difficult challenges. If you look back on histories of art and design education, it has always been the case. But there are particular challenges for that for the community in terms of higher education in the UK in particular, I know, but as well as curriculum time. Again, I'm thinking about the context in Britain. So we see it's a really important part of the role of the journal should be supporting that community of art educators and researchers. And one of the ways that we've done that is through events such as this. I have to say, although we've got our lead presenters for this session, we're really keen to know what you think about the issues that are being raised. So when as we go through the session, if you want to put any queries, questions, any prompts for further discussion, you can put those into chat. And when we pause, we'll come back and look at those as we go through. If you want to know more about iJADE, or if you are interested in joining our College of Reviewers and participating in the peer review process, then you can contact Dr. Emma Manesh, who's in our call. But again, Diane will put Emma's email address, which is ijade@nscad.org, into chat. And if you want to, as I say, if you're interested in reviewing for the journal, then you can contact Emma. So we really pride ourselves. I know we do get good feedback in terms of conferences, events, and as well as the quality of the peer review comments that are given. Part of the editorial ethos has always been that this is we take a very developmental approach in terms of trying to work with and build our community of researchers. So I'm going to move on to talk about why special issues matter. And this is something that we've introduced. We've always had special issues, and I know that we're not particular in terms of journals, academic journals. It's a key aspect of academic journals that they have special issues or commissioned issues or themed issues. I just wanted to highlight a number of these that have been published over the last couple of years. So more recently, we had our Peace Conference special issue that was edited by Dr. Emma Manesh. That's issue 44.4. Imagination, that was Professor Penny Hay, was the guest editor there, is issue 44.2. Time, which was again a conference issue, is 43.4. And Revisiting Arts Education, that engaged with contemporary philosophies for art education, that was guest edited by Professor Dennis Atkinson and Professor John Baldacchino. That's issue 43.3. So I just wanted to take this opportunity to highlight that, and also just to sort of remind us that having a special issue, I think, is really important, in particular because of this focus on digital access. So the platforms, all journal platforms now focus on this digital form of publication. And that means that people can pick up individual papers. Obviously, you can search for individual themes and pick up individual papers. But a themed or special issue allows us to bring together all of those sort of key concerns in a sustained way, where a theme can be explored, as I say, in a more sustained way. And there's a coherence to that issue, which allows us to get some breadth around different perspectives on an issue. It also allows for some real depth. And what's key around that, which I'll come to shortly, is the fact that those issues all have an editorial that's a dedicated editorial, and the editorials in themselves are pretty key in terms of identifying what that theme is and what its significance is in terms of contemporary research in art design education. So we've looked at those past issues. Again, following the web page, you can look up any of those past issues. We've got some future special issues coming down the line. Dr. Carol Wild is currently developing an artist teacher special issue, and we've got a special issue, Ecologies, which has come from our conference, our 2025 conference, and Dr. Will Grant is the guest editor of that one. And that brings us nicely now to our present issue, Rethinking Methodology Matters. And I'm really, really pleased that we've got Catherine Coleman, Abby MacDonald and Pat Thompson, who were our guest editors on this issue. And this is timely in terms of raising some debates and acknowledging debates regarding the nature of knowledge, So what counts and why? And for me, although this, a focus on methodology is significant across the board, and we really need to think about how we're approaching research and what shapes those sorts of decisions. For me, this also follows really nicely on the issue that was published by um, Dennis Atkinson and John Baldacchino, where they were thinking about key philosophical sort of developments. I think this is a really nice sort of partner issue, if you like, and relates well to that. So I received an initial draft of the what's described as the non-editorial for this issue, in which all of these co-editors are debating and thinking about the tensions between methodological innovation and some of the restraints maybe of academic publishing. And I loved the editorial or non-editorial when it came through. I thought, yes, this is what we want. We want an editorial that actually, I think the editorial stands alone in terms of raising these debates, but also reaches really nicely to introduce key ideas from each of the papers in that special issue. So I'm going to hand over to, as I say, Dr. Catherine Coleman, Dr. Abby MacDonald, and Professor Pat Thompson. And here they're going to introduce those key ideas from the non-editorial and open up our conversations. So I think we estimated that they're going to talk this through in for about 20 minutes or so. I have to say from the outset, we're going to be very flexible in this event. It is meant to initiate conversations, and we will take some of those directions as we go. But this first part is to introduce this non-editorial and give you some of the key ideas from that so that you can go away and engage with that more fully. So I've said enough. Over to you, Catherine.
Thank you. Maybe it's an uneditorial. It has me thinking about the non and the un. Anyway, thank you very much for having us. I want to first begin by acknowledging that we meet you from the unceded lands in Australia. I want to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the lands of which we work and research and live and learn, and pay respects to our elders past and present of the lands that we have the great honour and privilege of living and working on, where sovereignty has yet to be ceded. Where we live and work plays a big role in what it means to live on the other side of the world. And so it actually impacts on us every day when we start to think about how things come together, how things come to be known, and how our ways of being enacted and encountered for the rest of the world. So it's been a great honor to work on this together and pull it now into conversation. And so I curated some slides to try and think with the I've been trying to think of a tactful way of saying fast, free, and loose ways that Abby, Pat, and I might work together in. That makes us sound maybe more funner than we might be. But fast, free, and loose ways are the ways of how this has come together, because it's been like quick ideas that we've just run with and gone yes over. And when that happens, I think you're onto something really exciting. So what does it mean to curate this as well? We've tried to stay in what it means to actually rethink methodology matters. Mattering having all of its openings that you hope that matter might have. And then what does art and design education research through the White Cube enable us to think with? So we're going to kind of jump in and over the top of each other. The slides are designed in the whiteness to invite that conversation about the White Cube. I'm going to start because I've been thinking about this a lot today, because I did a methodology masterclass earlier today, and I was able to locate the White Cube back into that in relation to tonight, and thinking about who has access and what the literacies are of the White Cube. And so I was talking with graduate students about the the literacies of art and art education and how you actually get in the front door. And so often in the white cube, the door is even difficult to try and work out what's the door and what's the long glass plane. And if you have the ticket, you know, if you have the way to get into the building and you have the literacies and the fluencies to participate in that world, then you know that maybe that glass plane is not the door and the door is maybe around the side. And those literacies are enacted and enabled in sometimes hidden ways. In curriculum language, we might call them languages that are literacies that are often erased and hidden from us because only those who have access get access. And so what does it mean to think with the concept of the journal in this particular way for three artists and three art educators speaking into and around what was gifted to us? What was gifted to us over a summer break where we caught up with each other over hot days online, talking about articles that had been, you know, generously shared with us for us to try and trouble, and in that troubling, try and piece together. When, you know, nothing is neutral, each of those voices come with some important knowledge that we need to think about how we piece together to tell a different story, and how you tell an art and design story when art and design have times of the world that are very far apart from each other and times of the world that are very close, and in times of crisis, which we find ourselves right now. So we wanted to start with what is the cube, white cube, because maybe not everybody always knows what the white cube is. It's one of those things that if you know it, then you have knowledge around it. And sometimes it is just, you know, something that people don't have access to and maybe don't know how we might be thinking with it. So the claims of neutrality and a space that presents itself as objective and unbiased container for art removes context and severs the connection between the work and the outside world. And a quick, you know, snapshot of what one looks like to your right, but you know when you've stood inside one and you know what you've participated in. So try and maybe take your mind's eye to that as well. But it disciplines vision, and it's a curated environment that dictates how we perceive and value what is inside. And so we pose that provocation to you in our non-editorial. And it was also something that we quickly and loosely and joyfully ran with when it came as an invitation to Abby and I from Pat. And I was literally sitting in a gallery working at the time when I was able to respond. And Abby was also working in the gallery context. So there was an invitation that felt like it was meant to be when this all occurred. And I think those kinds of zeitgeist or serendipities are the kinds of things that happened, that hopefully you also read in the way that the papers were selected and the way the conversations that then happened between them, if you think of them as a curated gallery site. Pat, did you want to introduce us to Brian?
Well, I guess this is a text that most of you know very well. I think, Kate, you said you read it in art school,
Yep.
and yeah, you too, Abby. And it sort of came to me because we were thinking about how it is that our own experience of writing is that it's more possible to push the limits of the genre of the paper if you're writing a chapter than if you're actually writing for a journal. And in fact, academic journals haven't really changed their genre much in half a century. Academic publishing's got more greedy, more rapacious, more extractive of our labour, more profitable, et cetera, et cetera. Um, meanwhile, our employers and those of us that are self-employed, donate, and our labour is paid for to make all this profit. And I was kind of, it just struck me how much like the kind of the white cube was. And while in fact I think art thinking and philosophy has moved on past the white cube, it did seem to me to be a kind of apt description, particularly of academic publishing, which is kind of stuck. It seems to me for all kinds of reasons, not the least of which is that our institutions themselves rely on it so much for all kinds of things, including promotion and employment and reputation management and whatever. And so there were some things about the writing on the white cube that seemed to me to connect with academic publication, in particular, the kind of notion that this is a sort of neutral space, but it's actually riddled with power relations, that it's kind of, has been going on in this kind of timeless fashion, that it's an objective space, that, it's a kind of doesn't take an ideological position. And of course, all of those of us who write for it, we in academic journals, we struggle with how much of our own selves we can actually reveal in the journal article, even if we adhere to epistemological positions that, there is no outside, the researcher is always present in the research, whatever. There's always big questions about where to put that and how to put that. But the white cube of the journal publication, like the way, O'Doherty wrote about the gallery, sort of makes that invisible. It sequesters that. That's kind of outside what happens. So that was kind of the reason, really, for making the invitation. I guess you called it very kindly, Catherine, but what I kind of galloped down in the middle of the night sometime here. I've been thinking this. What do you reckon? Was, I think, the way it actually evolved, as we were thinking about, and I guess partly speculating what would the people who had put articles into the special issue, what more would they have wanted to do that they weren't able to do? It was a kind of question that I think we partly considered as well. If they didn't have to be so controlled by the genre, if they didn't have to jump through particular kinds of hoops that have become highly normalised, and that where inside the journal, those kind of commercial hierarchical power structures in which are just appear not to be working, and that's still a question for me. What would people do if they could do anything in writing about whatever kind of research they're doing, whether they're doing research on their own practice, whether they're doing research thinking about what art and design education could be, if they're doing empirical work on what's actually been going on in practice, regardless of the kind of research, what could we do if we just broke open the white cube in some way? I'm done. Oh, there you go. I'm not done.
Well, I was just going to say, on top of that, we had this really interesting conversation when we wondered, had the initial call not done what we thought it was going to do? So we thought when we wrote the call, it had done what Pat just said. And then this is why the white cube returns, because is it that we standardize ourselves into what we imagine the journal to be about, or is the journal actually about that? And it was something that I would say that we have stayed in tension with from when we wrote an initial call to reading the first ideas for papers, to formally selecting papers, to then into the non-editorial. And for me, that tension hasn't gone away. Is it something that we imagine, or is it something that comes from a built imagination. So you get your first reject or you get your rewrites, and then you build and construct a story around it that way. Or is the journal actually still the white cube? And who knows?
Mm.
Because maybe maybe our non-editorial will do that piece, which is maybe it will shift, but we know, and I know I talked about this paper today, but you know, Carl Lego's way of speaking into the journal, I think, is now maybe 15 years old as a journal article that is a series of dot points and positions, which I think about all the time. And I just wonder how that might happen today. And is it just an impossibility that that happened at the time? Um, but if the journal article is the white cube, then how do we disrupt it? I am hoping that our conversation that we've gifted you back in our non-editorial maybe shift some of that. It's still clean and ordered and controlled and structured and disciplined, but we try to actually think about the power dynamic in it and what we might be able to open to the next, you know, the next group of writers that pick up the baton and think about how they might maybe paint the walls with something else or tape over the front door and do something else to it. So some parallel logics, and I don't want to go into these, but this was where my conversation with everyone had me continuously returning now for some time, many months of playing this curated entry with gatekeeping and rigorous peer review processes, controlled languages, standardized academic discourse, ritualized and formalized practices of citational practice, claims to objectivity, and this illusion of neutral clinical perspective, the highly credentialed validation through institutional authority and hierarchy that Pat's just talked about, and the unspoken default of the white male language. And how do we actually undo that is something that I think that we managed to curate internally to the piece, not just in the non-editorial, but what sits inside this special issue pushes at these things and some of the decisions that we carefully made, even asking continuous questions of, is this part of the world represented? Is this type of practice represented? Checking on ourselves to ask that and note that and then shift a paper to make sure that we were not just being representational for the purpose, but because of our shared worldviews and ensuring that knowledge was a shared practice and a shared understanding and not something completely controlled for us as doorkeepers inside the space.
It's funny.
Abs.
Yeah, I was just thinking there around the when Pat shared the prospect of the white cube with us as we were bringing that editorial work together, how uncanny it was how some of the features within that reflected what we'd done. So the fact that it came after was really interesting. It made me think about the things that we were considering, those hidden things that you mentioned earlier, Kate, and being really mindful as we reviewed articles around, the assumptions we brought or that the authors may have brought around what they or we thought was permitted or welcome or wanted, and how earnestly so many of the authors were in, thinking with the questions that we had, that was part of our process of unearthing some of those things that we may have assumed or might have hoped to see. But again, part of that process was thinking about, well, why? Why did we hope to see that? And this is what we have. So I thought that was really interesting there, thinking too around the parallels there with the work we were doing editorially, and also that parallel with the gallery white space, and thinking about like what do curators and gallery attendants do. And we've just had the Archibald and things announced here in Australia. And, I was wondering the ways in which things are curated what if you just handed that over to gallery assistants and the Packer Prize? Like, how would they present that and what would they say with that work through the curatorial process? It would be a completely different story, potentially. So it was just a really uncanny parallel that it feels like it was at the start of the process, but it came after. I liked that.
Yeah, unfolds.
Hmm. I thought that I just want to hop back to that, the methodologies gatekeeper for a minute, Kate,
Please.
because something I know we talked about together was that we started thinking about the ways in which, methodology doesn't just work to evaluate things and work. It plays an active role in making some work possible and also rendering other work potentially invisible. So it's this gatekeeping thing that methodology does, and that's a nice sort of connection there around that. It's not neutral. It actively produces knowledge worlds. There was some really great work that I think challenged us and that the authors wrestled with in the special issue. There was the great article there from Luo, looking at dominant quantity paradigms in China, and what could be reported on or shared or selected over something else. It got us thinking around the ways that method can function as a filter of reality, and what a reality might be here could be completely different somewhere else. And that was part of that process of being mindful of, what were we asking for and looking for in the works.
Mm. Yeah, what carried power?
Hmm.
I'm th really quickly thinking about Ken, Marzi, and Rita, but also Kathy's paper that asked us to think differently about um, voice and agency and authority.
Hmm.
And I don't even have the names of the papers of those right in front of me, but I'm just thinking about how those two connect into this kind of conversation around who gets to tell stories and how stories are told, and then how knowledge is produced from that storytelling. Um, that came differently in those papers from me. They're not papers that I even reviewed, but they're papers that I've gone back to because I knew the authors, and so now that they're curated into that space, they tell me a different story in this context. Um, did someone want to talk about the problem of neutrality? I know it's me being problematic putting this here.
I just like that idea of neutrality, like the white cube. It's, presenting itself as objective and
Yeah,
um but it's,
letting her work
we
speak for itself.
yeah, and through that, I think that us as a team came to notice that is deeply ideological. Um, and taking that neutral stance creates certain privileges that will, it's kind of despite best efforts to, be objective and neutral, that is a stance that has a really profound effect and impact on a whole range of things.
Mm,
And I think that, we noticed that tension of that. It surfaced in quite a few different ways across the issue, and that the authors were conscious of this too, and in, varying degrees of awareness, and there was they were wrestling with that sometimes really tentatively and then sometimes deliberately as
mm,
they sort of wrestled through it with their methods that they chose and what they did with those methods. So there was some really great articles there in the issue that explore that
mm,
from different sort of perspectives, and it asks us to think about, what counts as rigorous.
mm,
Often seems to depend on how successfully a method performs neutrality rather than how well it engages reality, perhaps. So it's like a
mm,
performative thing.
mm. I think that what we were gifted in these papers are these acts of relationality. And so sometimes the way that you now read a paper in that special issue in relation to another special issue. For me, I can actually feel the way that we carefully held those relations. And so it's not like we were thinking about individual papers. Special issues hold, it is a curatorial, it is an curatorial imaginary and an exhibition of these spaces. And so you can move from one paper into the other paper. And the methodologies then coalesce. They have a conversation with each other, and the different sites and spaces speak with each other.
Hmm. Yeah, just picking up on a question there in the chat around the ways that the peer review operated throughout the issue.
Mm.
We were really fortunate that the three of us were able to work together, contributing review to some of those articles, and we were able to draw from the fantastic base of people who give that labour and service through iJADE as well. So it was nice to know that, like, while we were having these thoughts and conversations and questions as we reviewed works, to also have that input coming in from outside our bubble was really, you know, enlightening as well and important, I think, especially when we're thinking about our thinking. It's
Yeah.
having those different sort of what about this and what if questions from different vantage points is really important, but giving attention to them as well as
I
part of
mean,
the peer
I
review.
think we did probably what editors ideally do, which is have conversations about the peer reviews because we, between us, read all the papers
Yeah.
and reviewed them. And I think one of the things that we did as reviewers, which we discussed, was refer people to the call and the kind of desire to really push at things. And I think that was perhaps distinctive about what we were trying to do, was to try and encourage people to push a bit, most of the papers, I think, to push a bit harder on where they're thinking about methodology and methods might go.
Mm.
And I think
Yeah,
when we
to
did
not
that
take them for
too,
granted.
yeah, we were kind of encouraging gently and sometimes really explicitly that invitation that, you're welcome and you're permitted to, what else, what more, what haven't you said yet about this that you might, or that you might have been sitting on the fence about. So I think that certainly was something that featured a lot in my own thinking through the reviews and tailored questions along those lines to try and make that really clear that we would wanting to you know allow and encourage people to sort of push at the edges of stuff.
Mm. To misbehave in the white cube. Because
Yeah,
otherwise, yes, if you just practice these ritualized ways of knowing, then art for art's sake or, theorizing or writing for theorizing and writing's sake is all you end up with in a journal article. It is not the it is not the purpose of art and design education, and it's definitely not the purpose of an art and design education journal. The misbehaving and the irreverent and the loud and the embodied and the large is not in binary to what's expected in the white cube, but it's a different behavior that actually asks us to think with each other in relation to all that surrounds us, and to push the authors into that space meant that we just, as you said, gave them permission to do it, because otherwise the ways of behaving inside the journal are learned from somewhere, reminded from somewhere, rewarded from somewhere.
true.
So to push it, that sacredness of knowledge is what we were interested in. And then to think about how knowledge becomes legitimate, through the placement, through the peer review, but also we know that each person that is published in iJADE, and we even as editors, institutional recognition is the thing that then becomes really important. And so for people to have pushed and misbehaved at the White Cube, it is important to now have institutional recognition around. It actually becomes, like you need people to push at things so that other people can follow you. what does it mean to have pushed at things to get this relational thinking around methodology and how what methodology matters and the matterings of methodology to make sure we can push at that has been an important thing that I think the non-editorial tried to do the last push on to do the last knock at the door, and to ensure that there was not exclusion.
Mm.
The white cubes request of us, if we locate ourselves in the gallery space, there are these non-dominant epistemologies. Art and design education's job is to push against that, to not only invite what is known into art and design education, but to push at what is unknown, what's been erased, what's been left out, what's been discarded. Its job is to think carefully around what kinds of practices need to be understood and known and felt and embodied for the kind of planet that we live on. And we need to think about the kinds of bodies that are not invited in when we think about our roles as art and design educators. And then the role of our field's journal is to make sure that that also happens, and not to exclude or to leave things out, but to actually rupture those things, and then make sure that irrupture actually makes it possible for people who won't otherwise have access. And we hope that that's what we've been able to do with this special issue. So that then we end up with this, the mess, the politics, the feeling, and lived experience that you don't necessarily read the ongoing conversation that was wrapped around our editorial, but the conversation that wrapped around it was messy and fast and affective because it was about lived experience. We were wrapped up in not just the methodology as a special issue, but our own methodologies, and trying to bring them together to then think in relation to all of the people that we'd sat with, and sat alongside for some time.
Yeah. I
And so what
remember
gets
how
stripped away is a big white wall and turned into something way kinder.
Yeah, we thought we were thinking with that quite early on. I think this is another great example of just how returning to the white cube for the editorial writing was just really apt. This act of decontextualization, began early. It begins early in research, within those methodological choices that, they carry political weight and they shape what can come to be known, long before and if something even reaches the point of publication. And that, it's sort of, this was one of the things where I found myself really kind of wrestling with that. This is what we should do when we're, in the white cube of a gallery. This is what we should do when we're, shepherding works through a journal for a special issue that's looking at a topic. There was that sort of pull and just actively thinking about just resist that for a moment and stay with that, moments where things might feel a bit out of context or, contradictions and things, because that's where that with methods begins to matter.
Mm-hmm.
And there's an interesting parallel between what we were thinking about methodologically and what we were thinking about editorially with one of the papers actually in the special issue, which examines the way in which practice-based PhDs are textualised, and similar kind of dilemmas. So the thesis itself is also another kind of construction, if you like, one of Kate's Tupperware boxes, that has similar sets of relations that trap us in, and position us in particular ways, and where obviously we need to generate possibilities for working with and against those kinds of structures.
And I like this too. It's sort of this opening of the white cube. Kate and I were talking earlier, and it's like it's hard to do. You've kind of got these really fixed edges, and it's hard to crack them open. And we both were able to think about some of the works that created some of those cracks. That it's important that we kind of lever those cracks that have been made before us in what we do next. And it's, this cracking open helps shift us from critique into possibility, and it opens up those boundaries for research that, will move from that more detached observation towards relational engagement. And this was porosity. I love that we kind of went into this as well. It felt like a really good
Yep.
frame.
We had many discussions around porous methodologies and inside-outside blurs, art design blurs, how to ensure where art education speaks to design education, where art education methodologies speak to designerly practices. Um, the the ongoing dialogue that happens around a special issue. I wish there was some way of recording that the white cube also doesn't enable, but the actual conversations that were porous, that had these interweaving our research into the conversations of others, are something that a reviewer gets to do in conversation, but they're not actually in conversation because you have to write this text down about the conversation in a paper rather than being able to blur what's happening between the three of us and the authors inside the other papers. But there's something about blurring the interactions that I feel we're a privilege to be a part of for this.
Mm. And that seepage and slippage and things that sneak in when we think more porously about this stuff as well.
Yep.
It doesn't sort of abandon rigor, but repositions or relocates it in relation, with responsiveness and accountability.
Yeah. So this is what we've tried to do. Think around what needed to be in a Methodology Matters special issue. Artistic and designally informed approaches, practice-led inquiry, post-qualitative provocations, and then to have this kind of final methodological pluralism, not to resolve method because that's an impossibility, but to try and agitate through its curation. And I think even if you just run your way through the open access articles, by them being your jump out points, I hope that for me, that's what happens at least. That agitation through the curation starts to come alive for you in the way that we think about mattering.
Mm.
So we shifted from method users to method makers, from compliance to invention, and into some kind of worlding or reworlding, to think more about the kind of gallery as a gesture. And so our editorial is not an object or a product, but it's some kind of activism or action to think about what the gesture might enable, and to try and stay with the tensions. Again, not to break down the white cube, but to keep rigor and creativity and publication and practice. The institutional requirements and institutional needs, with experimentation, and inclusion and exclusion. And these things are not in opposition. They're tensions that pull at each other, and I think have pulled at each other right to the publication of the special issue.
Mm. And it lets us think about these tensions too, not just as, problems to fix, doesn't it? But the tensions create these contextual conditions that deserve attention, for the ways that they shape how we imagine and might enact or remake, the ways in which we work with methodology and methods. And, it's keeping with that thing too around some of the constraints is, if we're working in this space and thinking about it and sort of pushing at its edges, we have to remain within it to some extent there, and we're bound within those systems that we inhabit in our work and our lives. But an important part of how we sort of make sense and meaning of what that does is through that reflexivity, that reflexive practice. So, for us, I think as an editorial team, we were thinking, reflecting a lot. We were in dialogue a lot. We were in conversation. We collaborated to arrive at sort of a shared way to capture something. And I think that was really essential for how it came together, from where to go.
Hopefully a practice of opening to all of you into the porous, relational, speculative, and accountable. And if you haven't read all of the papers in this special issue yet, then you need to actually be able to piece those relations together, to actually see the way that we tried to undo and not completely step out of the white cube entirely, but to notice and trouble and stretch and rework what might happen in art and design education as we go forward. Abby and Pat, the
I was
end of
just
our
thinking,
journey. Is there anything else we need to share about this with people before we hopefully get to talk to some authors who maybe have entered into a different conversation with us because of this thinking?
I was just looking at some of the questions there, and the Pat had mentioned there too around what we didn't think about in the call for papers, like to actually go right back to the call for papers. I'd like to, what would that look like now
Yeah.
if we were to write the call again? I think it would be very different because there would be lots of other things in there that, important questions. I mean, that's something for me that's sort of come out of this. There's lots of questions still to come, that I hope that as people explore the works in the special issue, that's going to generate and provocations and questions for you, to be thinking about. So, things like if methodology shapes what can be known and whose knowledge counts, what might we now choose to notice or trouble, and we work in our own practice, and returning to the work that you've done to what would you do? How would you unravel it and redo it, differently? This generated lots of thinking and revisits for me because it like the fact that we delved right back into really works that I hadn't read for 20 years or more. It's worth revisit. It's important, to revisit and return to these things. That's where the shifts come.
Yeah, it does.
So Claire, I think it's back to you.
We get to open our container.
Okay. Thanks very much. So I know that we've been responding to some questions and comments in the chat. Dennis Atkinson, we mentioned Dennis earlier in terms of the work on the previous special issue. And Dennis' comment here he talks about ideas from Strathern. It matters what ideas we use to think other ideas. I'm just putting that there in case you want to comment. I mean, I'm conscious as we were talking, the context for this focus on methodology, which started, I can't even remember, so 2 years ago, something like that, because it's obviously takes a long time to get this stuff going, but we're very conscious about a particular agenda within in the UK, within my context, around certain types of evidence base that started to emerge and be prioritised, which seemed to be in tension with, some of the more maybe exploratory arts-based research. That there's just been a tension there that I think that's something that was what we wanted to explore. I am going to open this up, so if people do want to actually speak as well, it's absolutely fine. There were Nikki Sim had posed a question, I think, which was important. I know, Pat, you'd responded here. But Nikki was saying about a call and how calls go out and how we reach different audiences. And I think this also chimes with Will Grant. Will's on the editorial team, asking questions about actually from the starting point, from our research, from how we conceptualize it. It's not, the publication is like, if you like, a final, or hopefully not a final, but it's more of an end point or product. But it's all of those processes are stacked up in a particular way that do tend to prioritize certain types of knowledge form in terms of gaining funding. But I think Nikki's point here is really important in terms of, how we extend to, different communities, or, are we just talking within the white cube? I don't know if you want to respond to that in particular.
I think we tried very hard to not think within the white cube. But it does take some careful and responsible curation, which is how our field works, to think carefully about how you respond to what you are gifted, but you do have to think about who already has access. I mean, I've just been doing research in a museum for a year, and I had somebody say to me recently, well, it's already biased because you've only got people that already worked out how to get inside the gallery. And I actually agreed with him straight away and went, I totally agree, but I don't just do research in here. So it was a quick answer to me, but it is true. The people who already know how to get in, so the people who knew how to find the call to break open methodology, how do you find the people who can't find the call to crack open methodology? And does, I mean, it comes back to our question. We're not trying to break the white cube completely down, but how do you open the doors wider? I mean, we've talked in the museum sector for 25 years that we needed to move to a participatory museum. What does the participatory journal look like? What does the participatory 2.0 look like? Of the journal is something to consider. And then what would that look like in a methodology matters would be very interesting.
Mm. And that makes me think of the dominance of academic writing. I know that's certainly an area, Pat, you've done extensive work on with your Patter blog, in
Yeah.
terms of thinking about the nature and sort of power around academic writing. Interestingly, if you look at the iJADE instructions for authors, the idea is that we take a whole range of different types of format of paper. In
Yes,
reality, all of our submissions are traditional written
I
submissions.
know. It's
Uh,
so
even
interesting, isn't
though,
it? So do we do that to ourselves?
well, I think one of the things for me, is thinking about models and
Mm.
examples and people knowing and showcasing how those things are done. And once those things are available within that store or that library of the journal, you're more likely to see it. But the problem is at the minute is that, there's an element of replication. I've just put in, sort of coincidentally, I was reading a paper by Lisa Slominski called Curating Difference, where she's writing about some of the curatorial issues around Nena Carlu's work and this
Mm.
idea about how do you curate when you're working with somebody who doesn't have a traditional notion of voice. And Slominski talks about this idea about a coalition of approaches,
Mm.
which I think if you've got the journal standing as it is with its systems, practices, maybe it's not, maybe it's what sits alongside or with it that interacts with it. I don't know. Don't know if you want to say anything about that potential for coalition of approaches or not.
I love it. And I think Emily just picked up on it because if we do, I mean, I can paraphrase her quickly, but if we do move, like if we take seriously the idea of moving beyond the white cube, how do we rethink who is allowed to produce research? The what counts as research, and how expertise is recognized. We tried hard to move within, but again, you are constrained within what you are gifted within the response. And so do you not have special issues and you just have journals that open a special issue on a special issue on a special issue, always in response to the previous one? Like how do you crack open an idea, is something that the coalition, you know, might be able to do if you thought about it like that, so that the special issue always pulled from something internal to what the previous special issue held, maybe. Um, but there is something around the self-constraining. I mean, we know that just with student assessment. If you show a model, then you get the model. If you if we've tried to pull apart the white cube here, what happens next, or do you just return to what you thought you should produce? It
And there's
should be
that.
our field that pushes and breaks things, though, shouldn't it?
Mm. And there's that thing too there, like the example, showing a model when you get the model, around that sort of conditioning of behaviours and knowing and understanding that, people in different settings, they will yearn for that so that they can feel that they can get a foot in the door, um, into a space that they don't feel that they've been able to yet. And if they don't get the model right, they've somehow missed that opening, of not being able to sit, see themselves in there. So that's for me is like that's a generative tension, like a productive friction sort of thing where what you being able to have that, but also the parallel alongside it where there is no model and we make the model and then we would look at that together. So maybe through that sort of coalition, um, sort of thinking that could be brought to that. But that's, that would be very unsettling for a lot of, learners, teachers, um, to do that work. But it would be, we need to be able to do all of those things, not one of those things, I think.
Yeah. I mean, it
But
is, I think that's the job of art and design education. So a journal for art and design education should do that. My belief in our field is that we do pull those things apart and we enable people to understand how to exist in a world that is biased and unjust and inequitable, and then produce responses that speak to those things. So they're all live tensions of what it just means to be alive in crisis. And how do you have a journal that responds to that? Um, yeah, I mean, it does that criticality, around what journals look like and feel like. I mean, I've sat very tensely in this because I don't write journal articles. I choose not to. I'm one of the people that says that my work doesn't belong here. And I've been told by many journals that my work doesn't belong here. And so, that kind of thinking for me is always very present. I don't write in the kind of form or tense, with the text that's required. I produce art, and then it's really hard when it comes back and it's like, well, this is just going to be a black and white image, and really it's just a footnote to the thinking rather than the work is actually the work. So I'm one of the people that's sitting in the tenseness of this. Um, and obviously, I didn't submit a journal. I didn't submit an article even for the special issue I worked on, because I don't write journal articles because of the kind of work I do. So I'm sitting in this tenseness and feeling those tensions very present. And we had that conversation all the way through too. Like who gets access, who gets to speak, who has the authority, what journals do you choose that let you do that thinking, and what journals does your institution ask of you because they
Mm.
think that journal is more important? The
Yeah,
tensions are all very present every day.
yep, yes. That just, yeah, the tension around, you find a really kind of a space that feels like it could be home for you to, articulate your work and have to share it, to discover that it doesn't meet the, markers of quality or, esteem that your institution would like to see you publishing your work in. it's but I mean I've been in, you would know that over the stretch of time, however long you've been in academia, that shifts a lot too around, this is this matters now for where you publish and what you publish, and then a couple of years later, no, this matters now. So meantime, you're in the same time that this special issue came together over a couple of years. It does not feel like that, but a lot of the terrain has changed. So, you're doing that work on yourself and what you want to do and why it matters, based on the terrain, and then that shifts, and you sort of like, sometimes you're lucky that where you were heading is suddenly yes, and then other times you're like, oh no. I've went down a tangly hole. And by the time you pull yourself back out, you should have stayed there. So it's frustrating.
Can
I
I
think one of the issues is, and the reason we talk, I think, about the journal and the journal article is that in the arts and in art and design education, the process and the product are not separable in the way that methodology would see, well, here's a set of research, here's some thinking, here's a set of research methods, and here's, the text at the end, which just fits a basic kind of social science format or occasionally a humanities one. I mean, it's actually an integrated process, and I think that's part of the sort of underlying reason that we're concerned with the journal article is that it is a methodological, for me, it's a methodological question as well, about how it is that putting something into language or into image is part of that process of making the knowledge. It's not just how you collect. I hate the term collect. I'm out there just picking up little pieces of data in my little methods basket. I think we tend to see things differently than that, and I think that's the problem, is that the social science genre, I think the education is particularly dominated by the social science genre. I think some people bring humanities approaches into that, and philosophy, for example, and more interpretive kind of work. But that's hard. I mean, I've seen people doing exercises where they're marking research, rating research in education, where anything that isn't a social science article just gets out the window, and that's the pressure I think we're all under. And I think it doesn't matter so much for me anymore, but my work is still, I'm still getting work back from people saying, this is not a generalizable method. Well, no, that wasn't what I was trying to do. So, we'd hope, I think, that iJADE would be a place where people are able to firstly move beyond those restrictions, and I think that is the case. And then, given that they're not there, and there are affordances built into the possibilities of what you can submit to iJADE, I think it's about now trying to encourage more people to take advantage of what you actually can do, and perhaps the special issue is a step towards that.
Thanks, Pat.
Yeah, great.
I just want to just note a comment. Will Grant, as I mentioned, is one of the academic editors, saying that we do experience some technological constraints in terms of things like text color or layout, format. Actually, I mean, that is the case. There are some constraints there, but I think also in terms of my role is important in terms of being able to ask the publishers the questions about, why can't this, rather than just sort of settling with particular formats or particular ways that the papers or that the research is made available. I think actually we can do that. So it's this idea that sometimes the editorial processes, we can constrain ourselves in the same way that
Mm.
we might feel like writers constrain themselves,
Yeah.
researchers constrain themselves. So I think it's just like pushing back and asking those questions, and asking the publishers in particular, like, this is something that we'd like to do, and to push on those things, because some of the constraints that we think exist don't always exist.
Mm.
I just want to pick up at Emily, as well, as in terms of thinking about historically determined who gets access, just trying to confront some of those systems. I'm just trying to note here also, Stephen Page has put a link in there, in terms of a journal of artistic
Mm-hmm.
research, through a focus on creative practice. And we know that there are journals who do that. This made me think also about early days, with iJADE and other journals, where there's sometimes a sense of competition between journals. And I've always been very much of a mind of having, we should have a coalition of journals in researching art and design education. I think
Yeah.
ideas around competition between journals are really, really unhelpful in that respect. So I think it's looking across and thinking about, that in terms of the community more general. So I'll just highlight that for people who might want to look at that journal.
Sean
And
has a wonderful contribution in there at the bottom, Claire.
oh,
Yes.
sorry. I'm just going to go. Tina Scarhill was saying, can we do more in terms of accessibility? And then another, I can't remember who, sorry, has just suggested about sort of younger, or maybe, yeah, younger audiences, and how we might engage with some of those things. So in terms of NSEAD, I think does have a coalition of approaches in terms of events, in terms of say AD, another partner publication, which
Mm.
is which does a different thing, and we're conscious of how those things maybe work together. But these are all important questions which we can't really answer now. But I'm really, really pleased that it set up these provocations.
Yes.
Um,
Mm.
and yeah, so that was about a younger audience, connecting. And I think, Michelle, it's safe to say we have tried to look at the connections more between iJADE, NSEAD, and AD, and think about how those things work. Not in terms of us all doing the same thing, think about what the distinctive contribution is.
Mm.
But certainly, I think there's still so much to do for iJADE in terms of, I love the idea that iJADE, it should be pushing, it should be interrogating itself. It should be held
Mm.
to account in terms of audiences from conferences, in terms of evaluation comments.
Mm.
We should take those things seriously, and follow
Yeah.
up.
I
And
would
I
say
really,
under your stewardship, your and Emma's stewardship, Claire, I think we've made real headway with that.
Yeah.
And what is really interesting to me is the way NCAD communities, special interest groups in particular, have been informing values of iJADE and how they're put into action. So I think about your work with the anti-ableist pedagogies group, for example. These things are increasingly starting to be in dialogue. And I would just say there's really, really exciting and interesting thoughts in the chat about exactly this. So I'd say, get involved in the NCAD community and help us make it happen, because it's the
Yeah.
community that do it. It isn't a special elite group that are working on this. It's us. It's all of us.
I love that the comments there. I think it was Nicola was talking about that, making research accessible and available, and understandable for, young people and children, and that this thing around like research translation feels like it's a word, the words that just float around institutions from time to time, and that feels like one that just is floating around a lot now, like around that your ability to be a really compelling and diverse research translator. And it reminded me of it's very hard to do. I'm sure you all think of occasions where you've either had your own kind of complex knowledge, or you've been working with someone, around how to story knowledge that is not yours, and how do you give that due diligence and do it with integrity, and do it in conversation is, I guess, the answer to my own question there is really important. But also that I like, so Sian, your paper around the when the boundaries on a boundary with the doctoral research.
Yep.
that idea of a special issue that explicitly bans traditional form. That sounds like something that Siam
I'm
might like
down for
to.
that.
Yeah, I think you'd be
I'll
perfectly
be I'll be
positioned
I'll be in
to.
that one, Sean.
Yeah.
And that ties in really nicely actually with Dennis saying about a term cat's cradling
Yeah.
of relaying. I referred to cat's cradle, and not everybody might know this, like
Yeah,
string.
tell me more. What's that
Well,
mean?
you basically make a shape
Thank you.
with string with your hands. It's late in the call to be starting this, so and then there's different ways of passing that string network to other people
Yeah.
with certain ways of doing that. And I'd made reference to that in some teaching a while back, and it just nobody knew what I was talking about at all. But this idea of like a hands-on sort of passing on of one thing to the next, I think, if that is what you meant there, Dennis,
Well,
it's a really nice way.
it's to do with the notion. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yep.
yeah.
It's to do with this notion of sympoiesis, this notion of
Mm.
making with, thinking with, building with.
Yeah.
In Cat's Cradle, you have the trust of a held out pair of hands,
Mm,
which is then taken on by another pair.
mm,
Oh,
And that involves this notion that Haraway talks about of responsibility. And that's not to do with individuals taking responsibility, but developing an ability to respond. So the responsibility
Mm.
comes out of the in between. It comes out of the relationships between, and you can use that notion quite properly, I think, in terms of pedagogic practice, where
Mm.
teachers and children engage with each other sympathetically. So,
Interestingly, Dennis,
which is
that's a
which is a very different notion of education than we have at the moment, which is
Mm.
all built on, well, you know what it's built upon. I don't want to go on that line, but if it's built upon sympathetic relations, you have a different form of educational practice emerging, which is built upon this notion of possibility.
I've
Pat?
never heard that
I was
before. The
just going to
cat's
say
cradle.
the
I
the
love it.
string relation pedagogy is actually First Nations Ghana
Yes, it's a worldwide practice.
pedagogy in
Yeah.
Adelaide. Yeah, so this is the oldest culture
Yeah,
in the world. So it goes right back.
yeah, it
This
does.
way
And
of teaching.
Haraway
Yeah.
talks about this, and Stengers talks about this, of it being such an old everyday practice among
Yep.
lots and lots of cultures. But
Mm.
it's such a simple but powerful idea of this notion of sympoiesis.
Mm.
That's lovely.
Well,
I'd
that would be interesting to think about as in methodological terms and the
Yes.
relationship between the
Well,
researcher and participants as
you know,
well.
you hear a quote by some. I mean, I'm very interested in Whitehead and his notion of, our enjoyment of actuality is a value experience. The best way
Mm.
of thinking about this is, how does something matter in this situation? And that can be passed on, and that can be cat's cradled in the same way that this journal can be cat's cradled, and other journals can be cat's cradled, and developing, as we use, we're always in questioning situations, and we have to find ways together of dealing with these questioning situations. And some of these will fail, some of these will succeed, and we have to accept that.
Mm.
I'm going to thank you very much, Dennis.
Mm.
I'm just going to
Mm.
give an opportunity for either Catherine, Abby, or Pat for any just brief closing if you wanted to just say anything, because we do need to wrap up. No, all is fine.
Pat's got her red muted microphone on. So does that mean you
It's
stop
like,
talking for the evening? I wanted Pat to have the last word, but I also want to say a massive thank you to Pat, because otherwise, I am one of the, punkish, annoying people that tries to steer away from the journal. And so to be folded into it and so generously and carefully looked after by everybody in this space, I have a great thanks for that. So Thank you, Pat.
No, thank
Yes,
you.
I would
Well,
second that. It's been a real
Thank you,
privilege.
Claire.
Yeah,
and
great privilege.
thanks so much to the three of you, and thanks for giving your time to this to the event. I'd also like to thank all the contributing authors that I'm not going to list them now. You've got a link to the webpage. I'd like to thank the editorial team, many of whom are in this call. So thank you very much, and their wonderful ongoing labours in terms of getting papers processed and through the journal and engaging with that so fully and on a voluntary basis. We have to remember. Thanks also to Emma Ariamanesh, who's the editorial manager, who keeps everything going with iJADE. And thank you all for signing up for this event. You might be engaging with this live today, or it might be that you're engaging with the recording at another time. Either way, I just really encourage you to have a full look at that issue and take a look at some of the back issues of iJADE and some of those other special issues, I think, that speak to some of these ideas around the significance of making our ideas very explicit around